What really happened the night a group of colonists dumped tea into Boston Harbor? The real story behind the Boston Tea Party dives into the truth behind one of America's most iconic acts of rebellion. This wasn't just a protest about taxes. It was a bold, calculated move that helped ignite a revolution. In this video, we'll uncover the motivations, myths, and unexpected consequences of that fateful night. If you think you know the story, think again, because history is never as simple as it seems. Want to dive deeper? Check out the true motivations behind the protest, how the British responded, or why it still matters today. The Boston Tea Party is often remembered as a simple protest over the high price of tea, but the reality is far more complex and deeply rooted in political frustration. The event was not primarily about tea or its cost. It was about the growing resentment among American colonists toward British control, particularly the principle of taxation without representation. By the early 1770s, the American colonies had grown increasingly angry at what they saw as unjust and unilateral decisions being made by the British Parliament, especially regarding taxation. The phrase "no taxation without representation" became a rallying cry for colonists who felt they were being unfairly taxed by a government in which they had no voice. The British Parliament continued to impose laws and taxes on the colonies without allowing them any actual representation within that legislative body. While Parliament argued that colonists were virtually represented, because British lawmakers supposedly considered the well-being of all British subjects, the colonists rejected this logic entirely. They believed only their own elected representatives in their local colonial assemblies had the legitimate authority to levy taxes upon them. The anger intensified after several acts passed by Parliament, including the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, both of which placed financial burdens on the colonists. Though some of these taxes were repealed due to colonial resistance, the British government continued to assert its right to tax the colonies. The Tea Act of 1773 was the final spark. Though it actually lowered the price of tea by allowing the British East India Company to sell it directly to the colonies bypassing middlemen, it still maintained a small tax and reinforced Parliament's authority to tax the colonies at will. To many colonists, accepting this tea, even at a lower price, meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. The colonists feared that if they gave in on tea, more taxes and tighter control would follow. This broader context is what gave the Boston Tea Party such power and lasting significance. It was a symbolic rejection of British overreach, a message that the colonies were not willing to be silent subjects. The Boston Tea Party was a dramatic public act, but it was driven by deep political philosophy and a growing belief in the rights of self-government. It helped unite people across different colonies under a shared cause. What started as a conflict over taxation evolved into a movement for independence. That's why understanding the true motivations behind the Boston Tea Party is crucial. It was never just about tea. It was about liberty, representation, and the future of a people determined to govern themselves. It may come as a surprise, but the Tea Act of 1773, the very law that sparked the Boston Tea Party, actually lowered the price of tea for American colonists. At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. If the tea was cheaper, why did it trigger such a dramatic and rebellious response? The answer lies in the political and economic implications of the act, not just the price tag. The British government, facing financial trouble and mounting debts from wars and empire building, was looking for ways to support the struggling British East India Company. The company had a huge surplus of tea sitting unsold in warehouses, and Parliament's solution was to allow it to sell directly to the American colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. This would make the tea cheaper, but at a cost to colonial business owners and political autonomy. By allowing the East India Company to undercut local merchants and monopolize the tea trade, the Tea Act effectively created a corporate monopoly. This enraged colonial merchants, many of whom would lose business, and it alarmed everyday colonists who saw it as a dangerous precedent. What would stop Parliament from granting similar monopolies on other goods? What was being lost wasn't just money, it was control. Even more important than economics was the Act's symbolic weight. Although the Tea Act lowered prices, it retained the existing tax on tea established by the Townshend Acts. To many colonists, buying the tea, even at a discount, meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. It wasn't about the few pennies saved on a cup of tea, it was about the message it sent. The tea became a symbol of submission to British authority. Colonial leaders like Samuel Adams understood this deeply. They knew that if the colonies quietly accepted the tea, it would weaken their stance against taxation without representation. Protests were quickly organized to prevent ships carrying East India Company tea from unloading their cargo. In Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to send the tea ships back to Britain, creating a standoff that ended with the infamous Act of Rebellion on December 16, 1773, when colonists boarded the ships and dumped the tea into the harbor. So, while it may seem ironic that the Boston Tea Party was sparked by cheaper tea, the act was never about cost savings. It was about defending principles of economic freedom, political representation, and self-determination. Accepting the tea would have meant surrendering those principles. Refusing it even through destruction was a bold statement of resistance. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a spontaneous riot. It was a carefully planned and executed political statement. Organized by the Sons of Liberty, a secret group of colonial activists, the protest was the result of weeks of preparation, communication, and coordination. Far from an emotional outburst, it was a strategic act of resistance meant to send a clear message to both British authorities and fellow colonists. The people would not accept unjust control without a fight. The planning began when word spread that British tea ships, carrying East India Company tea under the Tea Act, were heading to American ports. In Boston, tensions rose quickly. Unlike in some other colonies where the tea ships were turned back or the cargo was refused, Massachusetts Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson insisted the tea be unloaded and the tax paid. This put the colonists in a bind. They couldn't allow the tea to be sold, as it would set a dangerous precedent of accepting taxation without representation, but Hutchinson's refusal left them with no peaceful option. In the weeks leading up to the Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty held town meetings and protests, rallying public opinion and building support. These gatherings were not chaotic mobs, but organized forums where leaders like Samuel Adams spoke to packed crowds about the dangers of the Tea Act and the importance of resistance. They also monitored the movements of the tea ships and kept pressure on merchants and customs officials not to cooperate with the British plan. The final act took place on the night of December 16, 1773, when around 60 men, many of them members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, a symbolic gesture representing American identity and distancing themselves from British culture. Under the cover of night, they boarded the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, the three ships in Boston harbor, and methodically destroyed 342 chests of tea by dumping them overboard. They worked efficiently and non-violently, even taking care not to damage the ships or steal any goods. In fact, when one padlock was accidentally broken, the protesters replaced it the next day, emphasizing that this was a protest, not looting. This level of organization sent a powerful signal. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just about tea or taxes. It was a message of unity, discipline, and resolve. It showed that the colonists were not just angry, they were deliberate, coordinated, and prepared to resist British authority through collective action. The image of Boston Tea Party protesters dressed as Native Americans, specifically Mohawk Indians, is one of the most iconic aspects of the event. But their disguises weren't random or meant just to conceal identities. They carried deliberate symbolic weight. These outfits represented both anonymity and a deeper message of colonial identity and resistance to British rule. On the night of December 16, 1773, around 60 men, many from the Sons of Liberty, darkened their faces with soot and wore rough clothing, feathers, and other elements meant to resemble Native American attire. They referred to themselves as Mohawks, a powerful symbol in colonial imagination. The choice was strategic. For one, the disguise provided anonymity in case anyone tried to prosecute them later. No one could be easily identified, and in fact, most of the participants' names remained secret for decades. But there was more to it than just hiding who they were. By dressing as Mohawks, the protesters were making a symbolic break from British identity. The Mohawk, a member of the Iroquois Confederacy, was widely seen by colonists as a representation of American wilderness, independence, and resistance to European authority. In adopting this image, the participants were not mocking Native Americans. They were embracing an idea of freedom rooted in the land itself and rejecting the polished, controlled identity of British subjects. This symbolic gesture helped frame the Boston Tea Party not merely as vandalism or defiance, but as a larger cultural and political statement. It told the world, we are something different now. We are not just English citizens living abroad. We are Americans with our own values and vision. The disguise also added theatrical power to the event. The sight of men cloaked as Indians boarding ships in the moonlight, silently opening tea chests and dumping their contents into the harbor, must have been unforgettable. It turned the act into a kind of political performance, one designed to be remembered, repeated, and retold. Exactly what happened over the following centuries. It's worth noting, however, that Native Americans had no role in the protest itself. Today, some historians and indigenous groups view the use of these disguises as cultural appropriation. But in the 18th century colonial context, it was seen as a symbolic rebuke of British norms and an assertion of a new American identity forming on the eve of revolution. The Boston Tea Party was not just a dramatic political gesture, it also inflicted massive economic damage. On the night of December 16, 1773, the protesters destroyed 342 chests of tea, which weighed over 92,000 pounds. At the time, the tea was valued at around 10,000, which would be worth several $1 million today when adjusted for inflation and purchasing power. This wasn't a few crates tossed overboard. It was a large-scale, deliberate act of property destruction that directly hit the financial interests of both the British East India Company and the British government. The scale of the destruction shocked many. The tea wasn't just a casual product, it was a cornerstone of British trade and taxation policy. The East India Company, one of the largest and most politically connected corporations in the world at the time, relied heavily on tea sales to recover from its growing financial problems. Parliament had passed the Tea Act specifically to help the company offload its surplus stock by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. The colonists' refusal to accept the tea and the outright destruction of such a valuable shipment sent a direct and aggressive message. Economic coercion would not be tolerated. What made the act even more disruptive was the protesters' restraint in other areas. They damaged nothing but the tea itself. No crew members were harmed, no cargo other than the tea was touched, and the ships themselves were left intact. This deliberate targeting made the protest harder to dismiss as mindless vandalism. It underscored that the destruction was calculated and purposeful, a precise economic strike aimed at a system the colonists found intolerable. The financial loss wasn't just symbolic, it demanded a response from Britain. The East India Company demanded compensation, and Parliament used the destruction as justification to pass the coercive acts called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, which included the Boston Port Act. This law effectively shut down Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, bringing commerce in the region to a halt and punishing the entire city for the actions of a few dozen men. Instead of isolating the radicals, the British overreaction helped unify the colonies, many of which sent food and supplies to support Boston. The economic consequences of the Boston Tea Party thus had far-reaching effects. What began as a bold protest became a catalyst for greater resistance. It showed the power of economic defiance and demonstrated how targeted actions could provoke major political shifts. The destruction of the tea was more than a loss of goods. It was the opening shot in a broader campaign for liberty. The Boston Tea Party didn't just destroy tea, it shattered British patience and triggered a harsh, sweeping response from Parliament that pushed the American colonies closer to open rebellion. In early 1774, shocked and angered by the scale and defiance of the protest, the British government passed a series of laws known as the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, these quickly became known as the Intolerable Acts, a name that reveals just how bitterly they were received. The centerpiece of this retaliation was the Boston Port Act, which closed Boston Harbor entirely until the East India Company was repaid for the destroyed tea. This crippled Boston's economy, as the city relied heavily on maritime trade. Ships couldn't enter or leave the port, putting merchants out of business and creating widespread hardship. The intent was to isolate Boston and punish it so harshly that other colonies would think twice before supporting similar protests. But the result was the opposite. Colonies from north to south began rallying in support, sending food, money, and supplies to help Boston survive the blockade. Other coercive acts added insult to injury. The Massachusetts Government Act dramatically reduced local self-government, placing more power in the hands of the royal governor and limiting town meetings, an essential part of colonial political life. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain or other colonies, which colonists feared would let them escape accountability. And the Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers, sometimes even in private homes, heightening tensions and fears of military oppression. To many colonists, these laws confirmed what they had long suspected, that Britain intended to rule with an iron fist, not as a partner, but as a master. The Intolerable Acts did what years of taxation and trade disputes hadn't. They convinced a growing number of colonists that peaceful reconciliation might be impossible. This prompted a wave of political action, including the calling of the First Continental Congress in September 1774, where delegates from 12 colonies gathered to organize resistance and assert their collective rights. In this way, the British response to the Boston Tea Party backfired. What was meant to discipline one city ended up fueling a continent-wide movement. The crackdown unified the colonies, gave radicals a stronger voice, and laid the groundwork for revolution. The Tea Party may have thrown British tea into the harbor, but the Intolerable Acts threw British-American relations into crisis.